This is Brian Drolet, and I'm from Deep Dish Television, and I'm interviewing my old friend and comrade David Barsamian, who's the founder and director of Alternative Radio, situated in beautiful Boulder, Colorado. David has traveled frequently and extensively in South Asia in the last 3 years and has spent much time there in the course of his career. And this past year and a half, I guess, you've been there 3 times. Right now, there's this intense battle going on between the Pakistani army, apparently at the urging of the Americans, and the so-called Taliban in the Swat Valley. And I know that it's a very complex and completely misunderstood or not understood reality for Americans. And I wonder if you could just paint the picture a little bit about what's going on in that region.
Sure, I'll compress a lot of information in the short time that we have. First of all, the U.S. Put enormous pressure on Zardari when he was visiting Washington just a few weeks ago to launch a major military campaign against the Taliban, not only in the Swat Valley, but also in the adjacent Northwest Frontier Province, the Malakand region, and the federally administered tribal areas, FATA. It's still known by that colonial name, that colonial acronym. And you have to understand the whole imperial background and the impact of British colonialism in South Asia, because the British drew a line in the 1890s called the Durand Line, D-U-R-A-N-D, named after Henry Mortimer Durand, who was the colonial secretary of the British Raj. And he divided the Pashtun people, the majority population in what is now eastern and southern Afghanistan and northern and western Pakistan. He literally draws a line dividing them, kith and kin on one side of the border and kith and kin on the other side. This was partly in punishment of the Pashtoons, who dared to resist the British military, who invaded Afghanistan twice in efforts to subdue it, first in the early 1840s and then again in the 1870s. So this was part and parcel of the whole British approach of divide and rule, and trying to create within the Pashtuns little principalities, little emirates, which they could then manipulate. This is a homogeneous group. Today they constitute about 40 to 45 million people in total. One of perhaps the largest group in the world without its own nation state. They're united by language, they're united by Islam, by poetry and music and cultural traditions. The Taliban in Afghanistan forms in the early 1990s, kind of an outshoot and offspring of the Mujahideen, the Afghan freedom fighters that were trained by the Americans, funded by the Saudis, to go into Afghanistan and oust the Soviet Union. So this is kind of connected to that. Many of the same fighters, people like Mullah Umar, for example, who's the head of the Afghan Taliban, he is a veteran of the Soviet jihad. But now their children and grandchildren are fighting with the Taliban. So the Taliban is an expression of Pashtun nationalism. It's rather conservative and hierarchical, and it is driven by a certain Islamic impulse, Wahhabism, which was the Islam that was imparted through the religious schools known as madaris or madarsa in Pakistan, which was funded by Saudi Arabia, and so they promoted the most intolerant and belligerent form of Islam, the type of Islam that regards, for example, Shia as infidels. I mean, they're Muslims, but according to the Wahhabis, they're not really Muslims, and they could be killed. So to understand what's going on today, you have to understand the past and bring that together. I know a lot of the cliches about Afghanistan, it's, Alexander the Great and their fierce fighters, and, people get their information from the Kite Runner and Charlie Wilson's war. And you can't learn anything about Afghanistan and the Taliban and the Pashtun people from, those two cultural artifacts. They're kind of infotainments, as it were. So now the U.S. has put tremendous pressure on Pakistan, and they paid for the pressure. Billions of dollars of aid is now flowing to Pakistan, and the trade-off was they would launch a military attack to oust the Taliban, who are Pashtoons. They're not, they're not from Mars. They're not from Jupiter. The people occupying the Swat Valley are Pakistani nationals.
How many people are we talking about in the Swat Valley, and what's the situation today?
3 million, the population of Swat Valley, which historically has been part of Afghanistan before the imperial cartography took place and split it off into British India, and then that became Pakistan. And when the Afghan government did not recognize any of the British-made boundaries or treaties, because they said, and understandably, Pakistan is a new state. We're not dealing with the British. We're dealing with their legacy, but we're not accepting their particular division of our historic homeland into two separate components. The population of the Swat Valley is around 3 million. 2.5 million people are currently displaced, and they are in camps. Many of the old Afghan camps around Peshawar are now just jam-packed with refugees from the Swat Valley.
And this is because of the Pakistani assault on that region.
Directly, a direct result of the militarization of the conflict. There had been a kind of arrangement made between the Taliban in the Swat Valley and the Pakistani government in Islamabad so that they could impose their form of Islam, known particularly Sharia, which is Islamic law, in the Swat Valley. Now, we may have certain judgments about this being extreme, intolerant, but the fact of the matter is that this form of Islam has adherents, it has followers, and some people want it. And it's the height of imperial arrogance for people in Washington, who don't know what Pashto is, who have no idea of the history, to impose their particular notion upon these people. I think that's the kind of quagmire that has been opened up that seems to indicate permanent war, no end in sight. October 2009 will mark the 8th year of the Afghan war. What is the end strategy? What is the end game? What is success? What is victory? Are we going to, kill every single Afghan? Will they all be collateral damage? Because when Obama is doubling the number of troops, increasing the drone attacks on Pakistan, which further infuriates and alienates the Pakistanis, the outcomes are not going to redound in any way in the U.S. favor.
And those attacks are mainly on the Pashtun areas within Pakistan.
Almost exclusively. And so what have the Pashtun done? I mean, obviously, they're not going to come out in the open and expose themselves to helicopter gunships and to drones and other attacks. They are fighting inside of Pakistan. So the war is now going further into Pakistan, into major cities such as Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi, and that has been the scene of many attacks.
One final question. As you look to the future, what do you see if the United States continues this approach of imperial domination of the region?
Permanent war, permanent occupation, and increase in alienation, increase in hostility and antipathy toward Washington, which is trying to impose its imperial will on the peoples of the area, and endangering the ruling elite, particularly in Pakistan, which is seen as an instrument of Washington's policy. They don't see, average Pakistanis do not see the government there in Islamabad working for them. They see them working for the Americans. Mind you, this is a very privileged group. They all speak English. You know, they shop in London and New York. Their children go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. They are a classic example of that, which Frantz Fanon described in Wretched of the Earth, a kind of a collaborator class, a quisling class that carries out the orders of the empire, enriches itself, and works against the interests of its own people.
David, thank you very much.
You're welcome.